Hello and welcome to the Practical Creative Podcast, where I talk to my guests about the how and why of creativity. As an actor and artist, I've developed my own creative process, but I'm fascinated by how others approach their work, comparing notes on how they manage their energy and mindset, how they think about their work, why they've chosen a particular material or process, and so much more. In this season of the Practical Creative, I'm exploring the idea of play, speaking with my guests about the role of play in their work and their lives, and what it is that we can all gain by incorporating a little more fun into our own practices. I'm Jeremiah Krage, and in this episode, I'm speaking with Dr. Mike Rucker. Mike is an author, an entrepreneur, and he also conducts research into workplace wellness. So what does this mean, and how does it fit into the theme of play? Well, I'm glad you asked. Mike has created some fantastic tools for measuring and assessing how you spend your time in order to live a more deliberate life. And this includes simple things that you can start doing today to put more fun into your life. Some of the topics we cover include why a balanced life is a fallacy. We explore Mike's play model, which offers a helpful vocabulary for categorizing different activities in your life. And we talk about coupling this with a time log to really focus in on how you're spending your time and where you might be able to, as Mike puts it, sprinkle a little more fun into your life. We also talk about how to be more proactive and avoid waiting for pain to move you into action, and how Mike uses long-term goal setting to create the life he wants now and in the future, and ensuring that he has fun along the way. Plus, yes, there's more, Mike leaves us with a challenge to take some of the ideas in this conversation and apply them to your own life by examining how you spend the 168 hours of your week. So if you've ever heard the saying that life is about the journey and not the destination, and then wondered how to have more fun along that journey, then there are definitely some ideas in this conversation that will be of interest. So please enjoy. So if you're ready to start, we'll just jump in.
Let's do it.
Okay, so the first question then is, who are you and what do you do?
Who am I? What an existential question. So currently I am a author. I'm a peer-reviewed researcher that's done some work on workplace wellness. And my day job, I am the vice president of a company called Active Wellness that puts fitness facilities within corporate campuses and residential centers.
What does workplace wellness mean?
So that's another great question, because I think wellness has become a sort of dirty word in 2017, 2018. So a lot of times they'll switch the narrative to well-being. And it can really, run the gambit with regards to my academic work from, mindset, physical activity, ill-being, someone that's looking to, mitigate a health condition, all the way to financial well-being, which is a big area of interest here in the U.S. as there are concerns regarding, our Social Security and things of that nature. So it's really, I think, if you looked at it holistically, it's the idea that your employer has some stake in making sure that you thrive as an individual.
Okay, so with that in mind, then why have you chosen to make play or fun a focus? As you said, there's so many different aspects to wellness. Why have you focused on that particular aspect?
Yeah, that's a rich question. I think for me, in my path in positive psychology and sort of looking at performance in general, and all the aspects of well-being, this construct of happiness really has a lot of noise around it. It has a rich set of research, but what we're starting to find is that when we point people towards pursuing happiness, oftentimes that the strenuous nature of pursuing anything actually leads to less flourishing and happiness. So what I did was look kind of, perhaps a little bit more simplistic, but down a layer, and the fact that fun and, different aspects of play really do have these medicinal benefits. I've been focusing more on fun than play, primarily because play is a wide spectrum of things that you can do, from childhood development to, organizational psychology interventions, things like icebreakers and all of the stuff that goes with company offsites and things like that, where fun is still a pretty broad construct, but it's something that's an action and things that we can do and sort of design our life around. And so that's why I've chosen to focus, really to sort of niche down and put my unique dent in the universe with regards to what I'm currently doing.
Brilliant. Okay, I love the idea of making a dent in the universe with fun. Because we often hear that term, associated to much more, yeah, I don't know, perhaps more um, technical endeavors, and it's great to link that to fun, which is brilliant. So, how are you going about doing that? Because I know you're currently researching a book that's focusing on fun. What is the approach? Like, how is it a matter of finding a vocabulary? How do you research something like this? When you say that it's quite a broad concept, and there are many different ways of doing it, and I imagine it's also tremendously subjective.
Yeah, and that's fair. I think, there are folks that are doing it and just labeling it different, right? There's certainly a lot of resources out there for parents that are struggling to sort of find, joy again after having children. And then I've also identified that a big subset of folks that find my content useful are entrepreneurs that have sort of prescribed to the Gary V's and the Cardones, in this 10x mindset for so long that they've sort of forgotten that there are other aspects of life that they need to be paying attention to. So, there's a rich body of findings, whether you want to look in academia or just anecdotally, that these things can be found easily as long as you're mindful of the way that you design the way you spend your time, and sort of identify, I think a lot of the times, for various reasons, we just don't take that few minutes to go, okay, I don't understand why, the day that I've just had seems like drudgery, because you get so focused on a specific goal, right? And again, that goes back to a lot of things that we've been prescribed. I know another popular book, The One Thing, right? Like that we need to be so uni-focused on whatever that drives us that we forsake a lot of the other things in life. And so there needs to be a new narrative created that that there's some folly in being so uni-focused on a certain goal. And I'm sure another thing that in this context that I've found fairly useful is that many things in life are a spectrum, yet to write easy, internet accessible articles, we look at everything as this Boolean choice, right? You're either successful and forsake all things, or, you live life in Burning Man and you're gonna, end up on the street. And it's just not that simple. And so where I found that I'm creating value is reconnecting people to the fact that, it's okay to clock off at 6 p.m. or it's okay to have, some self-serving interests so that, when you look back on your life, you're not like, oh my goodness, what just happened?
Right, and that's fascinating because, yeah, as you say, that it's not a message that we hear very often, and because it's not as perhaps as sexy or as shiny as saying by just doing this you will achieve more and get more done. So how do you convince people of the value of focusing on something that is probably, well, I would imagine, be easily overlooked or dismissed? When you say something is fun, it instantly sounds of less value. That it's a fun thing to do. I had fun. It's almost dismissive. It's almost a throwaway thing, as opposed to something to be protected and nurtured and developed. So how do you convince people that this might be something that they should consider putting more time into trying to cultivate?
Yeah, and that's interesting that you bring that up because that's certainly true, right? But on the other side, you have FOMO being a real thing that's studied now, right? So on one side, you have folks that might belittle you if you know, are too, you focus too much on jovial experiences or things outside of what folks would call fulfillment. And on the flip side, you have a lot of you're seeing increases in depression and things of that nature because people are fearful that they're missing out on experiencing life. So for me, what I found with regards to I'll be authentic, with regards to productizing this, I really think my message is reaching people that have an understanding that there's a missing piece, right? And again, those are sort of the two personas that seem to be attracted to it the most are actually there's three, right? So they're the parents that have realized that through some sort of organic life design, fun is now being excluded, and it needs to be reintroduced. Then there's the entrepreneurial class that has worked so hard at a specific goal, they've almost forgotten how to have fun. And for them, that's just awareness, right? They'll see something, some piece of content and go, wow, you know what? And, over the last 8 weeks, I've probably only seen my best friend twice. That's just not acceptable. And then I try to provide, real scientific evidence that that's also probably harming them both spiritually, mentally, and physically. And then the last is the aging well that, have realized that maybe they've forsaken some things, but that if they just, make a few small tweaks or spend the time to sort of reconnect to what they feel they've missed, that there's still time to find it.
Just listening to that, I was thinking, where do artists and creative people fall within those three groups? And obviously there's an overlap of quite a lot would be parents or elderly, but I think fundamentally that a lot of artists and creatives may not think of themselves as entrepreneurial, but have a tremendous amount of overlap with entrepreneurial culture in terms of starting with something that is a genuine passion and then working to find a way to make a living or make an income from that. And along the way, finding themselves working longer hours, feeling like they need to commit more time to this thing in order to make it work or to be successful at it. And potentially getting to the point where they are excluding these other aspects of their lives. Which I think is quite interesting that they may not be self-identified as entrepreneurs, but there would be a strong overlap with entrepreneurial culture and the potential downside of that culture. So what strategies, or where would you suggest someone start if they feel like they are missing some fun in their lives and they've identified that actually this is something that I need to address and pull back in and rebalance? Where would you suggest they start?
Yeah. So that's important because to your point, this is sort of, it's not at crisis levels, right? But this is certainly something that reaches all people, and especially, the high achieving creative class. And, one of the best ways to ensure that either you course correct or able to prioritize making sure that you're feeling fulfilled in all aspects of your life, is to look at your week critically. This is something that I pulled from wellness on the nutritional side, where, RDs generally have their clients write down what they eat in a 72-hour period, so that you can critically look at the inputs that are going into your mouth in this case.
What are RDs?
Oh, sorry, registered dietitians. I apologize.
Oh, I see. Okay. Yeah.
I've gotten really good at not throwing acronyms around because I know it's pedantic, but sorry, that one is just
No, it's fine. I figured from context.
And that also might be US centric. You might call RDs something different because I think that is, but I apologize. So
no, it's fine.
Yeah. So I grabbed that concept, so critically looking at how you spend your hours in any given there's 168 of them, and a good proportion of that 168 were sleeping. So it's not a hard exercise. But what we find is that when we do that exercise, we're actually surprised at a number of things. So one, things that we're doing that we probably don't need to do, that have just become habitual, where we could easily replace those with things that bring us fun and joy. And then two, looking for balance issues. I'm not a big fan of that term anymore, because I don't believe, at any given week you can truly balance out life and work, right? But I do think we can look for deficits, and if there is areas where it's drudgery, then it's easy to identify those and course correct. And so there's, as we go deeper down the rabbit hole, there are various tactics for doing that. But first and foremost, what we need to do is identify how we're spending the hours in our day, so that it's not guesswork, that we're using real data to make better decisions.
Yeah, I think there's something really interesting about the fact that you've taken the idea from nutrition, in that model of maintaining, say, a food diary or food log. What are we putting into our bodies over a period of time, and what is the outcome? And thinking about changing not necessarily your food diet, but your activity diet, and how that changes the way you feel is to my mind, quite an interesting parallel. So what you're suggesting is looking at what you're spending your time doing over those 168 hours of a week. And are you looking for things like, I guess, what are the warning signs? What are we looking out for? What are we looking either to avoid or to increase? How do we know what elements we should be looking at and trying to alter or change?
Yeah, so what I've devised is, basically a simple 4-quadrant model, but ultimately that could be adapted for however you sort of want to classify your time. What I've come up with is something called the play model, where you're classifying each hour into 4 different categories. So one is pleasing, which are activities that just generally bring us joy, right? Playing with an animal, talking to a friend, spending time with family. For some that would be agonizing. But generally just, activities that aren't completely passive, but that just fundamentally bring us joy. Then there's some activities that are hard, right? So ultimately, particular to your audience, right? Really deliberate practice where you're getting into a character that might be difficult. So while you're engaged in flow, and again, deliberate practice, you're getting true fulfillment and getting closer to mastery. But at the end of the day, that's not something that you could do, all the hours throughout the week, and making sure that those are baked in. The third class is things that are agonizing. So this is stuff that is truly just drudgery, right? And I'm careful here because I know sometimes some of the things that are brought forth could look like privilege, and they certainly are. I mean, some people are just, privilege is an inherent part of their life. But, if you have the means, depending on how much you value your time, there are things like laundry that can be outsourced. There are things, like taxes that maybe you realize that it's going to take you 8 hours to do your own taxes. And you thought you were saving money, but when you realize you only have to pay a professional 1 hour, one, you don't have to do that agonizing activity, and 2, you get 8 hours back in your life. So all of these are going to be very particular to the individual. And I'm always reluctant to share examples, because then people are like, self-actualize those examples. But certainly I think most people are going to find things that they could either replace or outsource and just basically expunge, and use their time more wisely. And then there's activities that are yielding. And this is, one where there's a growing body of research where we spend our leisure time in ways that we think is renewing, that actually doesn't bring us back energy. And you can do this through simple experiments. So first you have to do the time logging activity, but then, so let's take TV as an example. And sometimes this triggers people because I get, sometimes TV viewership is pleasing, right? If you're spending, only a couple of hours a week with a loved one, really engaged in a show, where there's dialogue between the two of you, and you're really engrossed in it and it's meaningful to you, that's certainly not a yielding activity. But I'll use myself as an example. For someone like me that comes home late after a hard day at work and just turns on the TV and mindly watches it from 9 p.m. to 11 p.m. So one of those hours is actually replacing time that I could sleep. Those are yielding activities that really should be moved into the upper quadrant of either living or pleasing. And so I find that's where people where the low-hanging fruit lies, that those, without going through this process, tend to just happen habitually because those are mindless activities, right? I mean, by definition, we don't really realize that we're doing those. And then we could continue down the rabbit hole. I think, there's a lot of heuristics that certain classes of people, especially parents, often fall victim to. And that's things like, I can only go dancing with my partner on the weekends because, that kind of activity is meant for the weekends, where, there could be plenty of activities that are actually, a lot better designed to do on a weekday. And that just, requires you to design your week differently. Comedy clubs is another big thing. Sorry. And again, these anecdotes, are ones that resonate with me, but I think, your listeners will find ones that resonate with you. But so
absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, I think that the personal helps to make it more relatable. It helps us to understand, because sometimes I think that those concrete examples, if it is from your own life or anecdotal, actually helps to illustrate what you're saying. So I go for it, absolutely. Because I love the idea of you coming home and then watching TV from 9 to 11. It's like, oh, great. Well, if Dr. Mike Rucker says that's that's what he does, well, maybe I'm not doing too bad. And yes, he's trying to work against that, but it doesn't make me feel too bad.
No, and so the anecdote I was going to use, and hopefully, I imagine you have a few comedians as part of your listeners. That's one. My wife and I absolutely love comedy. I mean, it's one of our favorite things to do together. But we kind of, inadvertently, were only going to shows that were these big productions, that would fall on the weekends, so that were, without scrutiny, seemed convenient, even though it's something that brought us a lot of joy. And so now, we'll go to a comedy club on a Monday, and there's all sorts of benefits from that. One, if you look at the economic cost in its totality, Monday nights listening to amateur comedians plus childcare is actually cheaper than buying 2 tickets to Lewis Black. So, this sort of initial assertion that it was going to be too expensive or too hard was folly once it was put under scrutiny. And 2, it's a lot more accessible, right? There are comedians that play every Monday, where Lewis Black might come in, Lewis Black, A-list comedian only comes through once in a while, especially where we live. And so now we can also consume a lot more comedy, which adds a lot more fun and joy into our lives. So, that's an example meaningful to me. But if you go through this process, you'll find, hidden nuggets like that in your own life that will just blow you away, where you're like, man, that only took me 5 minutes to uncover. Why haven't I done this sooner?
So is the suggestion to, say, take a week, and as you go through the week, log what you're doing with your time. And then when you get to the end of the week, identify where each of the activities that you're doing and where you're spending the time, where they fit within this play model that you have, and then assess which are the ones that you're going to try to change in some way.
Yeah, I think, again, I provided a model for classification, but, it's certainly a starting place. And I think when you go through this process, anything that you can, bring meaning to, you should do it. And so I think this gives a place for people to start. But ultimately, if there's a better categorization that's meaningful to you, then do that. But the whole idea is to, the first and foremost benefit of this is to really understand how you're spending your days,
Hmm.
and, making sure that everything that you're doing is deliberate, and looking for those potholes, so that you can adjust accordingly. Uh, One of the things that we find when people go through this is that on any given week, they're going to go, oh, yeah, but that week, was a little bit different because a friend was in town, or, it was a hard work week, or, et cetera, et cetera. So oftentimes we see people have to do this 2 or 3 times. And in, 9 out of 10 times, ultimately the week would, was only off by 2 or 3 hours. And so that's where the real insights come, right? So again, I would suggest to anyone that they only have to do it once, but ultimately what we find is that most people want to do it, a second or third week, just to validate all the surprises that came forth, because we generally find excuses why we're miserable.
Right. Okay, so I'm fascinated by this process because it seems so scientific, so logical. Is it in any way antithetical, sort of at odds with the idea of having fun? To to record what you're doing with your time, to classify it in these 4 categories, and then to analyze that and then make decisions based on that. Because isn't fun to just be spontaneous and to go with what you feel like doing at the moment and responding to what's coming into your life, as opposed to pinning it down and dissecting it and then classifying it as in a very scientific manner?
So I'm going to shortcut that question, and
Yeah, great.
with with 2 bullets, right?
Okay.
One, let me clarify, because I don't think we have yet. It usually comes earlier. Is certainly not all things are supposed to be fun, right? So,
I'm so glad you
um,
said that. Great. Okay.
yeah, by all means, we're there are going to be times where life is challenging. So, my sort of worldview is that we should have more fun, but that we shouldn't. I'm certainly not asserting that we should have fun all the time. In fact, quite the opposite. The kernel of that idea was an interview that I had with Chip Connolly, who's I don't know, this is more of a U.S. centric festival, but
Hmm.
who's on the board of Burning Man, and
Uh-huh.
there are a lot of folks that are dependently wealthy, that suffer, uh, from escapism, because they are able to sort of architect a life full of fun. And I don't think much actualization is going to happen from that. So I don't want to get off the rails, but I do want to go on record saying that not all things are supposed to be fun. Um,
Okay, great.
so with that clarification, if you saw yourself doing time logs every week, right? And I would say stop doing time logs because they're not fun. So that's the answer to that
Okay,
question.
great. Great.
I mean, certainly we know that from, which is interesting aspect of, nutritional journaling, because it used to be, that registered dietitians and nutritionists would ask people to keep a log of everything they ate. And I think that, a facet of my professional life, I also keep track of the digital health space. And so every mode of sort of health technology that has longitudinally asked users to track their nutrition has failed. So what you see most folks doing now is just asking users to take a picture of their food, because that's the easiest
Mm.
way, instead
Hmm.
of painstakingly trying to pick apart each meal from each stage of their meal design. And so the same goes here. I mean, unless you're a savant, or this is something that just is fun for you, I don't think this type of intervention is going to have much success if you ask somebody to do it longer than a week. And again, often why it only happens the second week is they don't believe the findings from the first week.
Yeah, because one of the questions that and I'm glad you've already answered this, which is, should we be trying to make everything fun when it comes to things like taxes and the school run, and should we be endeavoring to to enjoy or find fun in everything, or as you say, not everything is, and that's great to acknowledge that. So when it comes to then
But can I
there are
answer that? Because I want to
yeah
play in the middle. I do think we should.
yeah okay
No, because I mean it's an important part of my work, right? So not all things are meant to be fun, and but I don't think it's folly to try and find fun in most things. Like you don't want to go and try and find fun at a loved one's funeral, right? I mean that's
Mm.
not the time and place for that. But like for instance, most parents, or I would say a significant amount of parents, find getting their kids ready for school in the morning as drudgery. And anecdotally, surveying dozens and dozens of parents, that seems to be a commonality across all parents that have to get their kids to school. I have tried to organize that time to be more fun, to sort of be mindful of the experience, to know that there are components of that experience that are challenging, like getting the kids ready, when they don't want to put on their clothes, um, and add elements of whimsy and joy and opportunities for fun in it, so that all involved actually have a funner experience at the end, instead of trying to dig in and just go, I need to get through this experience. So
Mm.
I use that as an anecdote where, yes, I think in a lot of areas where we're like, this can't be fun, that's just not the case. There's certainly going to be times where it's either going to be impossible. Like, I use the tax analogy. I think it would be pretty hard to make taxes fun for most people. Or it's not appropriate. Again, like a funeral. Does that make
Okay.
sense?
No, it does, because I guess because that was the other question, is that sort of adjacent to that is that if you do a time log and you find that you've got a lot of things under the drudgery classification, like taxes and say the school run or whatever it might be in your life, are you trying to get all of that into the pleasure and satisfaction classification, or are there some things that you just have to accept as being what they are? But what you're saying, as you say, playing in the middle, is looking for opportunities to change your perception or your experience of some of those, not necessarily all of them and not all necessarily 100% of the time, but at least by examining it and addressing it, you're creating space for something to shift within that experience or your perception of it. So it may not be, you may not turn around and suddenly decide you want to become an accountant, but there might be another approach. And something that you mentioned previously was that also there's the possibility of replacing that whatever that activity is, possibly outsourcing it or finding a different solution to it. So, which I think is another interesting thing. So you're not necessarily trying to make it fun or find joy in the experience, but you're looking for what would be an alternative. That if, like you say, maybe you find an accountant or maybe you get a babysitter or whatever the solution might be, but at least by pulling it under the microscope, you are examining it and creating an opportunity to look for a solution or a different approach.
Yeah, and in that particular, the idea of options, you can really get creative, right? Again, I know uh, a lot of your listeners are folks that like creativity. I mean, it doesn't necessarily, outsourcing is a buzzword of the entrepreneurship community, right? So I probably use that too often. But if you're living with a partner, like, is it something where just because you haven't had that dialogue with the partner, maybe you could trade out that task, right? So if it's domestic duties, maybe I didn't realize that, I really just hated doing the dishes, but my wife doesn't mind. And I actually like doing the laundry and folding the laundry because I can be isolated and listen to music, right? So that's, you're not necessarily outsourcing, but you're changing your options. And
Mm.
then there's some things that we do repetitively that we don't have to do as much, right? So batching is another concept here where it's like, why am I going to the market every day, to buy these necessities when I could either, do it via Prime so it shows up to my door, or I could just buy this all at the end of the week. And I just didn't really put that together because I hadn't looked at my, what I was doing, that I thought I enjoyed stopping by the market every day on my way home to work, but actually, I could, do that in a more effective manner and use that time to do things that would bring me more joy. And then, to use an anecdote that might be applicable to, your listeners is, practicing craft in a certain way, or a coach that, after further scrutiny, it might just be time to look for somebody else that, will still bring you. So this is, in the more sort of complex area of living is, this is hard stuff. But if you're constantly doing something each week and you critically look at it and go, you know what, I could get the same value and probably have it bring me a lot more joy by simply, changing it up or trying to expand the options. There's all sorts of ways to tackle that. I see that with fitness. So I tried to apply a common anecdote that I use in my world, to your audience, but I'll just use mine because it will probably come out more eloquently. But you often see, I'll talk to folks that are like, I really love Zumba, but I hate this instructor. Right. And okay, well, guess what? There's 8 different Zumba classes. Like, all it requires you to do is, actually, audit 5 other ones, and you're likely going to have a much better time because you love the mode. You just don't like the delivery, and I would imagine that same idea could play with a whole host of different things, with the creative class.
Absolutely. Yeah. And what came to my mind was taking on an assistant or an apprentice. Like, I've spoken to several people who have a solo studio practice. So they are creating the entire product from beginning to end, be it books or pots and mugs or whatever it is. And there's a lot of tasks within that are very repetitious. By getting someone in who's interested in learning that particular skill, so you're getting a benefit from having someone else take on some of those rote tasks, but the benefits are much more than that, because you're actually then you're teaching someone else what you know and helping them develop their own skills. And as they progress in skills, they can actually take on more responsibility. And then they're not going to affect from that as well. There might be an exchange of ideas. There might be a breath of fresh air for the young person coming in, and they have a different energy as they bring it into the space, or it actually could increase your output. And I think, again, that's where the value of what you're talking about comes into play, is that, yeah, maybe it's not very fun to do this time log, but to do it once or twice in a year can lead to a whole host of new solutions, new ideas, and a fresh way of thinking about how you're living your life. Which brings me back to something I found really exciting, and in our earlier conversation before we started the interview, you used a term of living a deliberate life. Can you explain what you mean by living a deliberate life?
Yeah, so I meant, to kind of close the loops on some of the themes that we've been
Mm.
discussing, it's really just being aware of how you're spending your time, right? Often it's unfortunate that it takes, sort of a big life event, either a health problem or, the death of a loved one. Part of my origin story is that my younger brother unexpectedly passed away, to sort of, take notice of how you're spending your time and whether or not you're using it effectively and in a way that is meaningful, and bringing yourself joy, because ultimately, uh, the time that we have on this earth is finite. And so, I think one of the most important aspects of all of the variables in one's life is the way that we spend time. And if you're not deliberate about that, oftentimes we can be spellbound by things that are prescribed to us as important that ultimately aren't. Money, I think, is a big one, right? To some degree, money is a made up social construct. It's certainly a very important made up social construct, but if you look at it, in essence, especially here in the U.S., after the gold standard was sort of blown up, it's it's just a fake score, right? I recently interviewed a gentleman by the name of Noah Kagan from AppSumo, and I think he said it eloquently. And I'm going to paraphrase, but when he finally became a millionaire, he was sort of waiting for his sticker, right? Like, like we think that there are these milestones that ultimately are going to bring us fulfillment. And when we are so focused on that carrot, we completely forget that the journey is what enriches most of our lives. And so to deliberately know that the process of this, the way that we spend our hours, is just a lot more meaningful than, again, the tokens that we sort of accumulate throughout our life as indicators and artifacts of a life well lived.
That's fantastic, because I think that ties back into one of the things. I think the real value, as I can see it from doing this time log exercise, is that it allows you to sort of re-examine habitual behaviors, because we start, we tend to settle into routines and habits, and that extends to habitual ways of thinking as we get into a comfortable place in our lives. And this is a great way of re-examining that in quite a conscious way. And I agree. But my wife and I, about a year ago, got to a point where things in our lives were so uncomfortable to a certain degree, we figured we have to make a change. But it took a certain degree of discomfort, but that discomfort had to grow to a certain point where it was significant enough where it then had to be addressed. And often that can be too late. And afterwards, we made a significant change in our lifestyle and where we live even. And the benefits have been tremendous, but we've both thought, how did we allow things to get so far? How did we allow ourselves to keep adjusting and accommodating something that really wasn't acceptable? And how do we prevent them from happening again? And I think something like this is a great tool for helping you to reassess where you are and just to get a broader perspective on thinking about your life and how it's functioning versus how you would ideally like it to function. I just, again, I love this idea of living a deliberate life. So it's not fading into habit and unconscious decisions. Like you say, like, oh, I only do these things on the weekend, when in fact, maybe there are benefits to doing them at a different time, but to being very deliberate and focused about how you're choosing to spend that time. So,
well, and
I
you've
had a
been kind
great,
about, oh, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
no, I was just gonna say I had a great segue, but I can't remember what it was. So,
Oh, I blew it. I'm so sorry. No, I was going to say, so, thanks for the kind words about my word choice. I would say, something that you said that, that I like a lot too, is this idea of creating space, right? And so one thing that we know from science is that as humans, we're horrible predictors of the future, right? I mean, the future by design is fake. And so that's often, to answer your question, because it seems like it was somewhat of an existential crisis, is that you guys can forgive yourselves for the fact that, you wake up one day and don't know how you got there. I mean, unfortunately, that's part of the human element. And so what is important is when you do give yourself space to sort of figure out how you can find joy in the moment and certainly sprinkle opportunities for increasing joy and fun within the week, I think, it recalibrates yourself to understanding what's important, and ultimately will lead to better decisions. I mean, this is a bit out of scope for what we've been talking about, but I certainly think, decisions are like anything else. I mean, you can be, if you put them in autopilot, you don't get better at making decisions, right? And so oftentimes what you see is folks look for goalposts based on other people's, anecdotes. And if they're not thinking about them deliberately, then they're designing a life that was really, manifested by someone else's ideas. And so, but the problem is it's challenging to do that for yourself, right? I mean, it really does require you to do the hard work to understand, what's important to you. And then two, take the time to sort of, question some of the things that you accept as true. that likely aren't. And, again, a lot of these sort of social norms that certain things have to happen, and that things have to be done in a certain way. And oftentimes we can get creative and design a life well lived, in ways that are meaningful to us that would never work for the Joneses next door.
Okay, so I'm making a note because that's a great quote.
Well, and I think one that came to mind, I wanted to honor your story, and I don't know, as much as I would like about the decision you and your wife made, but for me personally, um, ultimately, my wife and I were living in San Francisco and realized that a big part of why we weren't able to do what we wanted to do was the positional economics of living in an expensive place like San Francisco. So we made the decision to move to North Carolina, which was a big part of the stuff that we've been talking about the last hour. Was a big decision in with regards to risk and reward and things of that nature. But at the end of the day, because we did it deliberately and with purpose, it bared a lot of fruit with regards to adding resources that we didn't have before, creating the space and time so that we could develop better relationships with our children, and just, the general well-being of sort of getting out of the rat race. But those things are hard, right? I mean, change, like uprooting yourself, are a big deal. And sometimes that's not going to be the right decision, right? If I was an aspiring actor, moving myself out of Los Angeles would be a poor idea, which is funny because I didn't think about it until now, but that's exactly. So I started my life in entertainment, and I went to University of Iowa because it was a school I could get into at the time, and it has a great screenwriting program. But it's in the middle of the U.S. The only sort of creative outlet that's close is Chicago, and at the time, that really meant that you were going to be, if you were a working comedian, you had Second City, but they are a mecca for, or at the time that I was going to school, you could get into commercial work because a lot of commercials were being shot there. But with regards to being in movies, unless you wanted to really grind it out on the indie scene, nothing was going to happen. And so I was smart enough to know that in that particular instance, I had to be in Los Angeles. So I went back to an LA school, and within a year I was working at Universal. So I just don't want to trivialize that some of these decisions can't happen for certain people. But it takes hard work to be able to, to get to a place where you want to be. And so I'd be interested in your story. Like, again, I imagine, it's never easy, right? And to your point, unfortunately, it often does take an inflection point to go, whoa, something needs to be course corrected.
Yeah, so I guess that leads to my next question, which is, when is it a good time to do this kind of assessment, to create some space to evaluate your life and the trajectory that it's on? When is a good time to do that, and how frequently should someone to do that? Because I imagine that, like, you've made this big change, you've moved to another state, and how long would it take before you start getting comfortable and things start to become habitual, your thinking starts to ossify perhaps, and then and then it needs to be analyzed and shaken up again?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, I don't know if you heard, but I interrupted by saying yesterday. So I think to get started, fantastic. There's no time like the present, right? Certainly if you've never done it before. But I think the intervals of of how you do it is dependent on you specifically, right? I've actually been exploring this, as bonus material for the book. And again, it goes back to, we talk about this in a casual manner, like it's Bowleen, right? Like that there's one way that fits everyone. And what I've been finding is that opportunities for fun are different from people that have a fixed mindset versus people that have a growth mindset. And so there's, a lot of rhetoric around, which one's better, and whether you have to be one or the other. But ultimately, how that plays into what I've been looking at is that some people are going to have an aversion for change. So looking at their life critically so that they can make course corrections, but then get themselves back on the rails so that they're feeling comfort in that routine. They might not want to do it all the time. For someone that's has a more of a growth mindset and is more exploratory, it might make sense every quarter. So I think it's really going to be unique to each individual. But ultimately, whenever there's a sense of discomfort, right? I think a good analogy, again, sorry, I continue to pull from the well of health and wellness, but you should never drink when you're thirsty, right? You should always, hydrate yourself, before you get thirsty. And so I think the same would apply here. As soon as you're just getting that sense of, feeling comfortable, there's no harm in sort of gut checking yourself. And if at the end of the day, the result is that you're right on track, one of the most important aspects of human flourishing is the ability for us to relish in the fact that we're doing things right. So creating an opportunity to relish in a life well lived, is kind of an amazing thing, right? So why not do it more?
Absolutely. Fantastic. So it's a win-win. You're either doing great or you've got an opportunity to make your life better.
Unless you hate life logs and then find something more fun to do.
Fantastic. So great. So what I'm really curious, what I'd like to do is actually make a slight transition here. It's still on the theme of living a deliberate life. But one of the things that I found fascinating in looking into the work that you've done and some of the things that you've done personally is that you seem to have a really great way of maintaining a long-term perspective on where you are now and where you want to be, and how to structure something to help you stay on track and help you continue to move in the direction you want to go. And there are two big projects that you created in your life. One is the Burrito Project, and the other one is ongoing, which is the Live Life Love Project. Could you talk a little bit about what those two projects are and how you went about constructing those in order to ensure that you were getting the outcomes that you wanted?
Yeah, I haven't talked about the Burrito Project for a long time, so this will be kind of fun. So thank you for that. And then the Live Life Love one is a little bit different, so I'm happy to talk about that as well, because I do think that's something that anybody could do. The Burrito Project one was really interesting. I'd always had a passion to create a restaurant, and so for that one in particular, it was really more a scheme than a project per se. But I found myself extremely overweight, and my hometown is Davis, California. And why that's important is the first Ironman champion, Dave Scott, came from that. So I have a lot of friends that have a vested, sort of interest in Ironman competitions. And I wanted to do something that kind of put a stake in the ground to achieve these sort of, initial goals I had in my life, right? One was to get my fat butt across the Ironman finish line. And the other was to get some startup capital and some interest around, creating a burrito joint on the beach. And so the Burrito Project was just that. It was basically a bet with my friends that someone that had little aerobic capacity could get themselves over the finish line, and that if I could, what I was asking of them was to also believe in my dream of being able to create this restaurant. So ultimately, I logged that adventure for a year. It was really neat because I think it was predated WordPress, so it probably cut my teeth, as becoming a pseudo blogger. The platform was Postnuke, but so I logged my journey there for a year, and ultimately got myself across the finish line at Ironman New Zealand and collected a bunch of money from my friends and opened a restaurant that was short-lived because ultimately I realized I'm not meant to be a restaurateur, and opening a restaurant is not fun. So I've gone on to do other things, but so that's the gist of the Burrito Project.
Mm-hmm.
The Live Life Love one was a little bit different. For that, to your point, it really was, a life design vehicle for me to make sure that I didn't forget about the things that are meaningful to me. And so those four, it's really three things. One is learning from folks smarter than myself. The other is contributing back to society. And then the third is experiencing life in fun ways. And so what I've committed to, I guess similar to the Burrito Project in the sense that it was a public commitment. And I, also was going to create external content around the initiative, is every quarter reach out to 2 thought leaders. Initially, when I started the project, it was in entrepreneurship and well-being, based on the affinities that I've, already confessed that I have. Now I've kind of, the 2 interviews, the thought leaders are kind of come from all aspects of life. I make sure that I contribute each quarter to significant causes. And then each quarter I try and do something that's sort of out of my comfort zone, or, in an extraordinary place, or, reconnecting with long lost friends. And so I kind of put my progress in those 3 areas online every quarter from my website.
And how long is the project running for?
So I committed to 25 years. And to be honest, I think everyone likes round numbers. I knew that if I did 25 years and you broke that into quarters, that I would learn from 100 people. And so that's sort of how I came up with the number. I wish I had a better answer for you than that, but it was really
No, that's a perfect answer. Because again, that's just kind of tying it back into this idea of living a deliberate life and not getting stuck or complacent. What I love about that is that you've created a structure that, provided you stick with it, you can see at the beginning what what you might get at the end. That at the end of this 25 years, you will have interviewed 100 thought leaders. I mean, that's an extraordinary goal, and it's an extraordinary carrot.
200 actually.
Oh, 200.
So yeah.
Yeah, I was wondering.
I told you 100. I meant 200.
Okay.
I think the 100 was pinned against making sure I did 100 things, and then no, but you're right. And so there were 2 facets. So one, again, people like round numbers, myself included. But the second was, I had when I started the project, about 5 years of professional experience under my belt, true professional experience. So I also knew it would coincide with about the time I would want to retire. And I figured, looking back at the project and, writing a summary of everything that happened within those 100 inflection points will prove to be fairly interesting, as long as I get there. But that I wouldn't regret, that I would look back at it without regret,
Absolutely. And I think one of the other reasons I was really taken with it is that I'm constantly collecting ideas on how do you cultivate creativity. And there's a whole range of different sort of categories that I'm looking at. But one of them, and I wasn't sure the best way of phrasing it. Currently, it's in my notes. It's taking control of your life. But I think living a deliberate life is a much nicer way of phrasing it. And it's so that you're not, that in order to continue to be creative and develop your creativity, that it can be, and to my mind should be, a proactive process, not a passive reactive process. So particularly the Live Life Love project is a great way of creating structure to ensure that you're continuing to develop whatever it is that you're choosing to make a focus. And I love the fact as well that you, as you've said, you started out with a focus on interviewing people within particular sectors, but that's changed, and it's spread to incorporate a wider range of interviewees. And that's wonderful as well. When you create something over that time span, there has to be some room for shift as you continue to grow and develop, and your interests expand or contract, whichever way it may go, that you are allowing space for that to grow with you. So it's not completely rigid and fixed. It's a loose enough structure to accommodate that time span and the potential growth that happens within that. And I just find that really inspiring as a way of both holding a larger perspective, so that we're, because I think as well, I'm fascinated by the fact that we can become so focused on the day to day, and that's another way of ending up 5 years down the line in a position that you hadn't anticipated and you may not be happy with, versus having this broader long-term perspective of your life and thinking about how you want it to pan out, where you want to go, in order to avoid those inflection points, those points of such extreme discomfort that then you're forced to change. So I just find it a really inspiring way of thinking about and taking control, and being more deliberate about how you approach your life.
Oh, I appreciate that.
With that in mind, then what?
No, but I think what I would add too is that it allows you to take a modular approach, right? I know, I'm racking my memory now, but I know I think it was the very first newsletter, I paid homage to Stephen Covey. And I think when you get in front of that stuff, some of this, I avoid most self-help, but there's some, that's just so foundational. You can't deny its merits. And one is, Covey's quadrant, this whole idea that we should avoid the urgent for the important. And I think that's what these kind of vehicles do, is that one, it creates space, again, to use your phrasing, which I love, it creates this personal space for you to invite important things into your life, whatever that might be. And two, I want to nuance a couple of things. One, this idea that fun can be found anywhere, right? Because I'm certainly not trying to prescribe a life of whimsy. I mean, I think you can find a lot of fun in engaging work. And certainly there is parallels between fun and flow. You can find flow without fun, but generally fun is, a close companion of flow. And flow is found when artists and innovators and folks that are, really engaged in deep practice are doing their best. And so, you can find fun in places that are also very fulfilling. And then the last thing I would add is, as you design things like, the project that I've designed, and again, however you decide to design it so that it works in your own life, to look at it as modular, and so to close the loop on that, again, this idea of quadrant 2 from Stephen Covey is foundational, and since that, 11 years later, I've accumulated, numerous other frameworks that I can kind of piecemeal together to get myself to where I want to be. And so, building upon that instead of mindlessly sort of going from one thing to the next and just getting work done is so important, so that you can sort of amass your sphere of influence on wherever you would like to apply it. Again, it goes back to that dent in the universe, right? You can't make that if you're not focusing your energy, pointed in some direction.
Great. Yes. So, but that raises a really interesting question, which is, how do you strike a balance between that kind of focus, like this is where I want to go with my life and I'm trying to steer it or have some agency in that, versus the single-minded pursuit of and almost becoming over controlling and squeezing the life out of it. So like, right, I'm going to achieve these milestones by X and Y date, and I'm going to have this much money by then, and almost over planning. Is there a way of striking a balance?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of compelling strategies to that. One that I like, because I'm kind of a geek about systems, is this idea in physics that all systems need slack. So I think foundational, and again, it goes back to some of the, it's closing the loops on things we began this discussion with, is that if you overclock yourself, it's just a recipe for disaster in all aspects. You're not going to reach your goal. When problems arise, you're not going to have the resilience to meet those challenges. And then ultimately, if you do need to pivot, you're not going to have the resources to effectively do that. So that's one. And then the second is, to bake in aspects of, different components of your life. If you're, again, I don't advocate work-life balance, because we just know that that's not true. On any given week, something's going to be a priority. If you have a sick child, then everything's going to go off balance, right? So if that's always your focus, I think you go throughout life pretty flustered, right? Because there's just, to have balance every week is fairly impossible for most. But if you orchestrate it so that in aggregate, I want that 10% of my life is dedicated to learning from others, that 10% of my life is, going to be dedicated to giving back in some way, to 50%, 50% of my life is going to be in pursuit of this particular goal. Then you can reverse engineer, validate, one, is that enough time? But then two, reverse engineer how it's going to happen in that amount of time. And so I'll use the Ironman as an anecdote. I knew that it was folly to think that I could competitively compete in that. But I did know, given the amount of time that I could dedicate to practice, that I could complete it. So I gave myself a hedge. To complete an Ironman, you have to do it within 17 hours. So I knew that I needed a margin of error, for an hour. So I trained to finish it within 16 hours. When I finally got there, of course, things went wrong. My knee started to really hurt. And so it took a lot of extra time than I thought. But ultimately, I finished the first one in 16 hours, 40 minutes.
Wow.
And so I think you could apply that, sort of audacious goal to anything that you want to do. And if it's something like, getting, a part in a particular play, you could just stretch it out. Like, what are the things that I need to do to reach this? And do I have the time to do it? And design in that regard. But, I loop back to the fact that you don't want that to consume 100% of your life, especially because sometimes things will go completely wrong. And, you also have to brace yourself that course corrections are going to be required along the way.
Brilliant. I love the idea of an audacious goal. That's just a brilliant spark in my mind to think, okay, yeah, what is an audacious goal? And the idea of creating slack so that there is scope for the reality of life, which is which is uncontrollable. There are certain elements that we can't control, that are out of our control, that will come in and disrupt the best laid plans. So anticipating that from the outset is a brilliant idea. So you're creating room for that, and I think that's really interesting thing in terms of percentages as well, particularly over a period of time, so that you can inherently within that there is flexibility, because there are other percentages that are available to allow for that, particularly over a period of time, so that you can adjust as you go along. And I think that's really exciting. Yeah, so I guess the last question, my last question on the idea of these sort of long-term projects is, do you have any advice for someone who wants to set out and create something like that for themselves? We spoke about it being modular and having some slack in the system. And is there anything else that you think that would be worth bearing in mind for someone who's trying to design something like this for themselves over a long period of time?
Yeah, and again, I think modular was more in the context of, putting together a body of knowledge that you feel, will be important to what you're trying to achieve. But with regards to a project similar to Live, Life, Love, I think look at the things that are meaningful to you, that you want to make sure you manifest in your life, and then just commit to doing them at an interval that seems reasonable. I think the biggest benefit for me in that regard, again, was that, 90 days with regards to the way my life unfolds is sort of the perfect amount of time to know that, hey, between these 90 days, I want to accomplish these 4 things. And I've done it in such a way that it's not so extraneous that I can't do them. To get the interviews together is about 8 hours. To do something fun is, generally a week or a weekend. And then to contribute, is anywhere from a couple hours to, finding the right charities that I want to contribute to giving back another week. So on any given, 90 days, we're only talking, 10 days max to accomplish what I want. So I would, look at the things that you want to accomplish and devise, in the same manner. The main thing you don't ever want to do is make it drudgery, right? As soon as it stops being fun, you're just going to stop doing it. And that's actually one thing that I find really interesting, that I stole from Tim Ferriss, but I think is, again, none of these ideas are earth shattering, right? It's really just bringing them forth so that people can go, wow, okay, yeah, this is super easy. Why haven't I done it before? And so this is another one of those types of ideas. But I think all too often we get into something and think we have to complete it. And if it's truly not bringing us joy, as long as you're careful that you're not, again, falling into the sinkhole of escapism where you're just, going from one thing to the next. But like, in his example, I believe he brought it up in 4-Hour Workweek. If you're reading a terrible book and you're 40 pages in, there's no reason you need to read it for the next 2 months. But I think part of human design is we feel like if we start something, we need to finish it. That was certainly ingrained into me by my parents. I think that is just an old dictum that's lost some of its utility. And again, as long as you're mindful that you're not letting anyone down, or that you haven't given something enough of a chance to see if, maybe you don't have enough data to make an informed choice, bail on anything that doesn't bring you joy. So where I'm going with all that is devise a project, kind of run it for a year. And if you find like, wow, that was really a dumb idea, I don't want to do 4 cool things a year, or, I've interviewed 4 people in the wellness space and I really don't like wellness, or whatever it is, right? Then just bail on it. But ultimately, I think, most people are going to know, what are the guideposts in their life that they want to align against. Certainly for me, it was fairly inherent.
Brilliant. No, I absolutely love that. Because again, it goes back to then those quadrants of where you're spending your time, and is this project starting to fall into drudgery, or is it in the satisfaction classification, which is great. Mike, this has been fantastic. It's been so great. It's so lovely to talk to someone who is I was going to use the word balanced in your views, but perhaps that's not the right term. But a nuanced in your approach, in terms of like acknowledging the fact that that if we're all striving for balance within every 24 hours of our day, I love the word you used, which was flustered. That it's not necessarily, it's more often than not going to work out. So that it's acknowledging the messiness of life, but then also finding a way of addressing that and trying to consciously make decisions to shift things in the direction that you would like them to go, but still creating space for the unexpected and the uncontrollable elements. And I think that is ultimately going to be a much healthier approach. And it's also incredibly inspiring. And I think that's the best thing to take away from me, that I'm taking away, is creating a vocabulary for examining or thinking about how you're spending your time, and creating the space for structuring the future. So you have a clear idea of where you want to go, and a structure for achieving those audacious goals. And I love that term as well. Audacious goals is great. And that's very exciting. So just thank you so much for sharing that with me and with my audience. That's really, really exciting. Can people follow you along on the Live Life Love project and where you are at the moment?
Yeah, I would love that, actually. So my website is michaelrucker.com. That's where you can find a lot of my content. And then I play on most of the social networks. So on Facebook, you can find me at Mike Rucker, PhD. On Twitter, it's Perform Better. And on Instagram, it's The Wonder of Fun.
Brilliant. And I can put all those in the show notes as well, so people can find them there. And do you have a challenge for listeners before we run out?
Yeah, sure. We've been talking about taking, creating a time log. I think we've certainly discussed the benefits of that. So what I'm going to do for your listeners is create an electronic copy of a rudimentary time log that's really easy to follow. And I will put that at michaelrucker.com/challenge with instructions on how to use it. And I would be really interested to see how it goes. Certainly, I would love to, anyone that needs any help, let me know. And then also just to hear how, the end of the week goes for you and what sort of insights this challenge has brought forth in your life. That would be great.
Oh, fantastic. Brilliant. And if you're all right, I would love to include an image of your play model of the 4 quadrants, the 4 classifications of how you're using that time. Of course. That would be great for people to see that as well, because it's a lovely visual that you've got as well.
Yeah, of course.
Okay, so just thank you so much. This has been great. It's been a very, very exciting and stimulating conversation, and I really appreciate it. So thank you very much, Mike.
Thank you.
Hey there. Thanks for taking the time to listen to this episode of The Practical Creative. If you'd like to learn more about my guests, you can visit the Practical Creative website at thepracticalcreative.life, where you'll find links to all of their work and the previous episodes. And if you're looking for something to stimulate your own creative practice, check out the Creative Challenges page. You can also sign up to receive my challenge packs, where I put all the challenges from my guests in seasons 1 and 2 of the podcast into downloadable PDFs. Just head over to the website and check it out. And while you're there, be sure to have a look at the resources page, where I've compiled links to all the materials and services referenced by my guests, including books they've written on creativity and business, online courses, Facebook groups, and much, much more. And if you've enjoyed this episode of the Practical Creative Podcast, it would be fantastic if you would subscribe to the show or share it with a friend or even leave a review on iTunes. And I'd also genuinely love to hear what you found to be exciting or inspiring or even challenging about these conversations. You can find me on Instagram at Practical Creative. Until next time.